There is a sense in which we are all performing for cameras now. The photographic language is taking over in a way that it certainly wasn't before. And I think this makes the exhibition quite timely in that sense. So hi, I'm Simon Baker. I'm curator of photography and international art at Tate. We're talking today about performing for the camera, which is a major photography exhibition at Tate Modern, which deals with the relationship between performance and photography. So what you're seeing here is how the photographers documenting the performance, how they did their work. They did a job for Yves Klein, but also what they got out of it and how they did that job. The documentary photographers were called Harry Schunk and Janos Kender, and Schunk Kender, as they called themselves, documented a whole series of incredible performances in Paris, in New York, in the 60s and 70s. And here, for example, we can see slightly how they're working. You see Yves Klein watching the performance with the audience in the foreground, then you see them zooming in, and then you see them isolating a fragment from that zoomed in image and blowing it up large. And I think this is something that you can see really nicely in the exhibition, that there's a balance between photography simply being used to document a performance, and then photographers taking that further and making their own work, making their own interesting images from it. So it's a much more sophisticated kind of operation than simply documenting a performance. Yves Friedlander's been making self-portraits as part of his work since the mid-1960s, and they begin as a kind of almost a game of hide and seek, where he notices himself in reflections of shop windows, or you see his shadow cast onto the pavement. And what's interesting, I guess, is that that began as a kind of game, and then that carried on for him to have realized, looking back through his work, that actually this was a really great part of his work. So I think it was in 1970, he had an exhibition of self-portraits where some of them were very obviously staged and others were very obviously sort of accidents. And what's also interesting about him is that he's continued to do it. So his recent publication, Self-Portraits, covers 1964 to 2012. So you have Yves Friedlander changing, growing older, and playing different kinds of games, still really curious, still really interested in the world, interested in his place in the world. One of the most exciting rooms in the show is a room of a Japanese photographer called Eikoh Hosoe. We might think of photography being about cameras, but it's about cameras, it's also about darkrooms, it's also about publishing and books. And Hosoe's work was always intended to end up as incredibly beautiful, luxurious photo books with incredibly beautiful bindings and special page sequences and special pages. Even Yves Klein, he made the leap into the void for his spoof newspaper. So I think this is something that when we think about photography, we should think about not only how it originated, but also where it ends up. For example, there's one artist in the show whose work was entirely perpetrated through Instagram. So she did a sort of takeover of her own account with a performance. And the interesting thing about this work, really, not only that it's an incredibly convincing performance, but also the responses. So people's comments about her were very tough and pretty aggressive sometimes. So this sense of not only performing for the camera, but also bringing up people into your performance so that the responses become part of the work is really interesting. So I think we see an experiment with what does it mean to be in the place of another? What does it mean to take on that role? Which is something that we all do in our lives, that artists do, that actors do, whether that's across gender or across time or across into a different discipline.